Hello, I'm Alan Bow, and this is my SGF presentation that's called Build a HTML5 Web App Using SAS. Phil Mason would have been here, but he can't make it. But I recommend Phil's content. Phil is many years' experience building web apps on SAS. Same for myself. Built a few web apps, including Data Controller, which is a commercial web app for building for managing data, which is uses the same kind of technology. So why build a web app? So why HTML5? Well, it's easy to build. There's guides everywhere. It's easy to deploy. It's built for interfaces and it's free. There are paid libraries, which are sometimes worth buying, but the components are free. Why SAS as a backend? It's secure. It's very scalable. It's built for data, as we all know, and it's free, which is true if you consider the marginal cost of building a web app on SAS. Everything you have is already there in the platform. You have a web server, you have a integration with your authentication mechanisms, you have a database. There's no additional costs to building a web app on SAS. So the architecture of a web app on SAS looks a bit like this. You have a client, which could be your laptop, a web server, so the SAS Web Server is part of your infrastructure. That web server talks to an app server, which could be a stored process server on SAS 9 or compute server in Via. And then when it comes to writing data back, then you use a database. And those are the four components to your architecture. So there was a division there between the front end and the back end. And it is an important division. We do see people building web apps using put statements in SAS programs, which does work, but gets very complex very quickly. So if you're looking to build more than streaming a simple table, then it really is important to create your front end for scalability, compatibility. If you use the right adapter, then you don't have to change your front end if you switch the back end out to Via. Speed of development. So by having all of your front end in a front end repo, you can use all of the front end build tools. Differing skill sets. If you're serious about building big web apps on SAS, then you probably want to have a dedicated front-end developer who knows the front end and a SAS developer. You do get SAS developers that know front-end and front-end developers that know SAS. But really, if you want to move fast, quickly, then you get two different people, one person who knows the front end, one who knows the back end, and that combination really works. Having standard interface for talking to SAS means that you are effectively creating an API to SAS, and having a standard interface will help you to document that API. And maintainability. It's much easier to find a generic front-end guide to maintain a front-end part if it's not wrapped in some SAS code. So design, we start off, do you know what you're going to build? When it comes to design, there's a split between the user experience and the user interface, and then design frameworks accelerating the design process. So user experience is the way that you navigate through the site, and user interface is the way the site looks. This, at least, you get a copy of the slides. You can follow them. Some recommendations. When it comes to frameworks, rather than creating all your own CSS classes, it's going to save you a lot of time to just use the generic frameworks that are out there. So you can just add some class name rather than writing your own custom CSS. So if you know what you're going to build, the next thing to consider up front is security. So the good news is, by the way that SAS is built, it's very hard to make an insecure app on SAS because it's mostly out of your hands and pre-configured. The authentication is going to use SAS Log, so it's already going to use your existing AD or LDAP integration. Authorization, again, you can't access any stored process or job execution service without it going through the SAS authorization who can access it. Some things to look out for. So, for instance, on SAS 9, if you're using a stored process server with a stored process system account, is something that could potentially be misused. So this is why you typically restrict stored processes to those teams that are subject to governance of the type of code that they put into production. So yeah, misuse of the SAS Via account. Code injection, so be careful about resolving macro variables straight from the URL. And man-in-the-middle attacks, so this is where if you're using an external script, potentially somebody could modify that JavaScript as you're downloading it. But there are ways you can mitigate that. For instance, SRI hashing. So this is a hash which you set up when you're referencing your external source, and your browser can then compare to make sure that the hash of this file equals that, and then there's no way that this can be subsequently changed without the browser knowing about it. In terms of security, once you start to add more services to your web app, you want to think about how you organize stuff. And by putting all of your services in dedicated folders, administration becomes easier because you can set the permissions at folder level. I'm going to talk about SAS.js. So SAS.js is a new framework for building apps on SAS, and there's a few parts to it. There's a macro library. There's a SAS.js adapter. So this is the part that handles the communication between the front end and the back end. And there's a CLI tool, which is going to help with building your content in a project repository and deployments. So the macro core library is full of macros. It's useful macros for building apps. So it helps you with things like creating folders, creating services, so stored processes or job execution services, getting lists of users and groups, etc. There is a documentation site. And the macros are split by folder. So base is like macro functions, macros that write SAS code. Metadata, so these are SAS 9 specific macros. And then Via. And then if you open any of these, this documentation is actually driven from the macro itself. So this is the macro, and the header is in something called doxygen format. So if you add this specific styles, then it generates this documentation. And this bit's worth looking at, dependencies. So by setting your dependencies in this format, so dependencies in the macros that your macro uses, you get this navigate through. So you can click through and see the macros that are in your macros. So it's quite neat, so we recommend that. But all the macro core libraries follow that convention. Macro core macros. That's the adapter. So this is the part that you will include as a JavaScript library in your front end, and that will handle the logon to the SAS logon. It works for both SAS 9 and Via. It's well tested and it's easy to use. It's on GitHub here. And just to show you the configuration. So you here okay your SAS server if you're not serving from the SAS server, and then this server type here, change SAS Via to SAS 9, and then your app will work on a different SAS server. And then app lock is either the location in the metadata folder tree or in the Via file service. And then the CLI tool. So this is what will help you set up a project, and prepare your project for deployment. So it's on GitHub, but you don't actually need to go to GitHub for this one. It's an NPM tool. So you do need to install NPM, Node Package Manager. If you're a front-end developer, this will be very familiar to you, and it's a command line utility that helps you easily download your external dependencies. So I'm showing you my terminal now. I'm changing into the temp directory. I'm going to install globally the SAS.js CLI. So that will download. You need to install this globally in order to make the command line tool available on your path. So now it's available. I can go SAS. And that will create a folder with, in an opinionated way, as in it will contain a folder structure in such a way that if you use this for all of your projects, then you will have a consistent, all your apps will be consistent. So change it to it, and if I look at the SAS folder, so tree SAS, there we go. So there's a build folder with a service in it and a service term. So this is these files get inserted at the beginning and the end of all of your SAS services. There's a folder set up to build your database, a DDL on the SAS. Then there's a macros folder. So this is where you'll put all of your dependent macros. And then a services folder with some example folders and some example files. So if I then go into that folder, say for instance, and I create a new table. I'm going to call a macro and to get you see here this macro is not defined. So if I go here and I reference it, so this macro is not in my macros folder. However, it does exist in the macro core library. So the way that the compilation will work is if the macro is not in the macros folder, it will look in the macro core library. So what I've done here is I've created a table called areas. I've created a second table called knobs, for the number of observations. And then I'm going to send that to the front end as an array format, like so. So I've defined a service here, a very simple one. It's going to write some data and send it back to the front end. And these macros also get inserted as part of the build process, and this will open the JSON, send the tables, and close it again. So now I've modified my macro. I'm going to prepare it to build. Oh, before I do that, I'm going to configure it in the config file. Configure it for SAS 9. I'm going to my personal folder. That's it. So I'll save that. I'm going to run the SAS.js build command. And this will then compile all my dependencies and create a deployment script. And this deployment script is something I can run in SAS Studio. You can see here it's got my application, and then at the end it creates the web service. If I just run that, oops. So this will go away and create all the services. And it will also give me a link in the log, so I can just verify that that worked. So the one we modified was called app init. And if I copy that link into a new window, I get the JSON back. And if I just confirm that is valid JSON, pasted something else in, validate, there we go, valid JSON. So yep, it works. This is the process that will create the stored processes for you. And as you can see, it was very, very easy. I just ran that command, it compiled. You can see that all these dependencies are included, and then you run it in SAS Studio to create the service. So that's what the CLI tool does. So at the back end, we mentioned SAS 9 and SAS Via. On SAS 9, the sub-services are known as stored processes, and Via uses the job execution service. They're very similar. On SAS 9, you can run your service using as a stored process, or on the workspace server, you can run stored processes under user credentials. And then on SAS Via, it's always the compute server. So On that point, if you run in Workspace, it's your client or your user account credentials, but on the stored process server, it's a SAS SRV account or the general shared servers account. On SAS Via, it's you're always your own credentials, but you can configure also a system identity from 3.5. And the other big difference on SAS 9 is that you have metadata, which doesn't exist in Via, but we do have the Postgres database. So automated build and deploy, we did the demo. This is where the SAS.js tool comes in, and that integrates in Git with the macro core. Storing code in the service in Via, that's kind of happens by default. In SAS 9 from 9.3, you can store code on the file system, but we don't recommend that. But actually storing the code in the service makes it easier to deploy. You don't have to touch the file system. It's easier to debug because all the code's in one place, and so it's more stable. I mentioned docs and headers. So this is what the SAS.js class tool uses to determine what the dependencies are. So if you're building services that have macros, list them here, and then they can be compiled not just for Doxygen, but also for the CLI tool. I won't go into all this, but if you're on SAS 9 and you're looking at, if you've got load balancing issues, there's some tips here. That's all backend. On the front end, it's a SAS presentation, so I won't talk too much about front end, but just to say that we do recommend you use framework. When you get started, it's very easy to just write an index HTML and start hand coding your HTML and remembering your closing tags. But using framework and using a professional IDE will accelerate the development of your front end because you get not just the auto completion, but all of the build tooling that lets you, for instance, write your code in TypeScript, which is a superset of JavaScript, and then that will compile down to ES5 script, which means that will be compatible with older browsers like IE11. So you can use all the latest ECMAScript functions and compile them, and then the compiler will convert them to older functions that work in older browsers. So frameworks and tooling lets you do that. And things like being able to change something locally and it will spin up a web server and do a hot refresh. So you can just make a change and then view it straight away in the browser. Will again accelerate the speed at which you can build web apps. And then CDApps and DevOps. So the frameworks, the major frameworks are Angular, React. The CDApps, so we've got CDApps for Angular, React, and then a minimal CDApp. So a CDApp is a repository on GitHub, has all of the boilerplate in it. So rather than configuring all of the config files yourself, just git clone a CDApp, follow the steps, and you can straight away, in 5 minutes even, have an app up and running. Some tips and tricks. So we're working in a browser, and in order to keep it fast, the biggest thing you can do is minimize the amount of data that you send. So as much as you can, pre-summarize and just send the least amount of data possible. To a degree, it's better to send more data in one request than it is to send smaller amounts of data in multiple requests. The reason being that while SAS is very fast at processing a lot of data, it's not the most responsive. So there is an overhead to each request, ranging from 400 milliseconds on SAS 9 to a couple of seconds on Via. And so yeah, fewer requests are often better. Paging. So your browser can handle quite a bit of data, but it will chug up and stop if it has to render that table in the DOM. So if you are displaying data and you're going to be more than a few hundred lines, it's better to keep the data locally, but just display a few hundred at a time. There's a lot that the browser does to speed up your app. So things like the caching of JS and CSS, that's automatic. There's a local storage facility that you can store data locally. Obviously, this won't work if you want to keep state when your user uses different machines or different browsers. Same with cookies. CDNs, what CDNs do is they provide a location which is closer to your physical location for caching things like fonts and icons. Server caching is something that if you have it still takes a long time to run in SAS, then what you can do is you can either calculate your results, or every time they're requested, you can store them. And what you do is you take a hash of the data that you're storing, or a hash of the query, and then next time that exact query comes along, you can check to see if it exists alongside that hash, and then send the summarized data instead of recalculating it. So that can really speed things up as long as your data doesn't go stale. This is a really good trick. Some coding tips. There's actually one missing there. This one, I use this a lot. If you're needing to navigate your folder tree, this is quicker than just going to the home page. Action equals 1063. There's the other one. So if you're testing your stored process web service, so when you write code, it will go to this web app file ref. That doesn't exist in, say, SAS Studio. But if you use this file name statement, as opposed to file name web app temp, that will break if you send non-standard comment like Excel files or PDFs. Web_web app with a cache engine. This is an undocumented engine, but it's basically a dead space that you can send anything you want, including PDF files. So worth having in your toolbox. Some gotchas. So I had a client who was running my STP, and they got different results than I did, and I could not understand it until I realized they were calling the STP from Excel. And Excel had a different locale to the browser. So the browser was US, the Excel was UK, which caused with the any date time format. So if you're using those kind of formats, those locale dependent functionality, then you will need to set your locale explicitly to avoid this, at least in SAS 9. Mem size and the amount of memory in your session is often lower on a web service, so something to look out for if you're just testing in SAS Studio. And then multi-bridges in SAS 9, the default multi-bridge number is 3, which is very, very low. It means that if you have 3 requests in one app, or 4, then start queuing. So multi-bridge is think of it as a pipe. You only get so many connections. So what they recommend is, say, 5 to 8 per CPU core. So if you've got 8 cores, then it's 40 odd multi-bridges. So definitely one to increase. Another one, if you're looking for a way to do error handling. So you've got %abort, you've got abort cancel, all of these variations. From experience and working in lots of environments, you have to be very careful with this because it can just hang the multi-bridge session. And like we saw before, if there's only 3 and 2 of them hang, then everyone else is left with 1. So I don't recommend using NSAS or abort. There's actually a really nice trick you can use, which is to open a macro, but don't close it. So what that means is that for all of the rest of the code just gets added to a macro that never actually executes. So that's a very quick way to just, no matter how deep you are in a macro definition, you can end your service. Another one, don't use usernames in folder names. If you've got users with special characters in their names, that can mess things up. In terms of building documentation, so once your app's done, you're going to need a user guide, a config guide, a deployment guide, even a developer guide. There's tooling you can use for this. So Markdown to HTML. This is a command line tool that you can say your README, and you can convert that to a HTML file. HTdocs. So this is the documentation tool used in like data controller. So you write in Markdown, you can embed videos and images. Doxygen, so this is the one that we used for the macro core library. And then Sphinx, which is similar to Markdown, but for often used in Python. Testing. So Browserstack is a good facility. Browserstack lets you test your code in multiple browsers. It's great if you're like me and you have a Mac and you need to test on IE. Cypress is an awesome tool. So this is a command line, but it can also launch a browser. So you can write all your front-end tests and launch Cypress, and you can see them run in real time. It can even control your front end, and you can record some tests that it can replay for you. And it even makes videos that you can watch. So that's really good. And then sasjs.io. So this is a website which has a lot of content. So all of the stuff from these slides, and then lots of examples and videos and sample code that you can use for building web apps on SAS. And then the app dev community. So there's a Slack channel, and if you've got any questions or you want to connect with other users who are building apps on SAS in this way, then you can check out this channel. So this isn't meant to replace communities.sas.com. That's also a good place to go and ask questions. And I think that is all. So I hope you've learned something. My name's Alan, and if you've got any questions or you'd like some training on building web apps, or you'd like some help building web apps, so I can help with backend, with project management, with providing front-end developers, or any questions at all, just contact me.